Hi, so today we're going to be looking at the Kelvin Tone Shaper by Tone Projects. Some of you might remember that I did a review a while back on Tone Projects Unison compressor, which is an amazing compressor. And they've done it again with this new plugin, which is a saturation and EQ plugin. And it brings some really new things to the table. It sounds great. It's got two stages of saturation and an EQ, and it reacts to the saturation reacts to the input audio in a very complex ways, like analog gear does, and the two stages of saturations interact with each other as well. And what makes it even more interesting, if that isn't interesting enough, is that you've got 3 bands of EQ, but not only you can EQ, but independent from the EQ cut and boost, you've got the ability to drive that EQ band into the saturation more or less. So that's also interacting with the saturation, and there are lots of great sounding saturation algorithms that you can choose independently for the two stages. And it's got lots of other great features. So we're going to have a look at that. Before we do, if you can subscribe to the channel and like the video, that's really helpful to me and really appreciated. So I hope you find this useful, and let's have a look. Here we have the Kelvin Tone Shaper, and I'm going to go through the controls fairly quickly. The first area of this is you've got the drive controls, and you've got 2 stages of saturation here, each one with a different set of saturation types, and you can drive one into the other. And the reason that they're doing it this way is because so much of in the analog world works like that. You've got one piece of gear that adds a certain amount of saturation, and it can be driven, and then it drives into another piece of analog gear that has a different saturation, and one drives into the other. So that's how you get the types of saturation that we're used to in the analog world, and this is doing a similar kind of thing to get you that complex interplay of saturations. So much further down much more than that is that this doesn't just add a static amount of saturation to anything that comes into it. It reacts, the way I understand it, it reacts to the input volume, the transient envelope, volume envelope, and frequency content. As that changes dynamically as the music comes in, the saturation reacts to that and changes depending on that input, much like analog gear, in the same way analog gear does. So you've got a lot of complex stuff going on here, and 2 stages both interacting in that complex way and with each other. So there's a lot of great features here. Obviously you can turn the drive up of each of these, and this one will drive harder into that one. But if you want to turn up the first stage without driving harder into the second stage, you want just to drive harder the first stage, you just hold down shift and it turns the drive of the second stage down by the same amount that you're turning it up in the first stage, which is really useful. You've got a big list of saturation types here, and a really nice touch is that it explains what each one is like, so you can get to know them, and really that's what you really want to do with something like this, is to experiment with different source materials with the different saturation types to learn what they sound like in different situations. You can even turn each of them off if you just want to use one of them. And the other really great thing is that you can swap them around by pressing this button here. So if you decide actually you'd like to hear what it sounds like the other way around, there you go. So really useful. So that's the drive stage, but then that is also controlled by this section here, which makes this extremely interesting capabilities of this plugin. You've got an EQ here, which is more than an EQ, so it's 2 things, and that's why you've got 2 sliders for each of these EQ bands. One of them is an EQ, cuts by 20 or boosts by 20 dB, so a really big range of cut and boost. But it also drives the saturation, so this will drive, if you set this to say 100 Hertz, or whatever it is, not only can you boost and cut that, but you can drive that frequency into the saturation circuit. So if you really want to thicken up your lows, you can drive them harder into the saturation, unless maybe you don't want to drive your mids, so you can pull down on the saturation in your mids, not drive those at all, but just drive the lows. Or maybe you want some really silky highs, so you want to drive them into the saturation a bit more, so you set this up here to the highs, and it's a very, very versatile saturation unit. And you've got the EQ as well. So, and the EQ gives you a lot of variation. You've got a low shelf on the first one, a tight bell, a wide bell, and an Pultec style shape, which is really handy to have. And each of these shapes drives into the saturation as that shape. So really, really handy, as well as acting as a actual EQ with the same shape. Plus you've got a high pass pre or post the saturation if you want, which is useful. The mid-band gives you, and the range of this is 10 Hertz all the way up to 500. The mid goes from 20 all the way up to 18K, so they overlap a lot, which is really, really useful. And for the highs, it goes from 500 up to 20K. So again, really useful overlaps there. And here you've got high shelf, tight, wide bells, plus a high Pultec shape, plus a low pass. So really, really useful. So this is an incredibly useful way of shaping your saturation and your EQ at the same time. And with all these different saturation types, you've got a huge palette of colors here. So what else have we got? We've got output trim. We've got a clip. If you want to make sure it doesn't go over, you can turn this on. It adds a bit of extra distortion if you drive into this. Dry and wet, that's useful. Over here, now this is an interesting one, because this means that it's got two positions, and it means that the saturation occurs slightly differently in each of the channels. So it's not like the same saturation applied, even though that saturation is incredibly varying all the time. With this down here, you get that same varied saturation happening in both channels. Here, it's going to vary differently in each channel, so you get more of a stereo effect without any worries about losing anything if you mono. There's not going to be any cancellation, and this goes even wider still. And it does change the sound of the saturation on some of these settings, as well as widening it. It's a subtle effect, but really nice. And then here, this allows you to, in this here, it filters out some of the saturation and cleans up some of the saturation on the high frequency. So if it's getting a little, you're driving it quite hard, but you feel like it's getting a little bit fizzy at the top, you can pull that back. And this does the same thing with the highs, but also pulls back a bit in the mids too. So super useful. Finally, up here we have oversampling, and you know, if you've got CP issues, you can pull it down. By default, it's on high, which no noticeable aliasing that I can hear, and on pristine, it's so low, you know, in any sense of being able to hear it, it's non-existent up at pristine, even at high drives. Really useful stuff. Plus, input and output as well. You can drive it more here on the input and pull down on the output there by just dragging. Yeah, really useful. So now let's have a listen to this. And I'm just going to select the channels that I've got the Kelvin on, which is on the drums. I've got it on the kick, the snare, and the overheads. So I'll start with it out, and then you can hear it coming in and out and compare. And we'll listen to it with everything to start with, and we can listen to the drums on their own. So start without. So you can hear a lot more punch and low end solidity, plus the highs get a lot more silky, and the snare also kind of comes out and becomes more present in a way that I was after. So let's now have a listen to the drums on their own without anything else. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bring this in and out. I'll start with that out and then bring it in. But I'm going to do, again, all three, and then we can listen to the drums individually. So you can hear really nice what it does to the silkiness of the smoothness of the top end. It really, like, quite a boost on the top end, which would otherwise could be quite kind of hard and harsh, but that saturation makes it smooth and nice. And the saturation on the low end of the kick gives that sort of low solidity, along with that Pultec curve which I've got on there, which also helps do that. And the snare is being nicely made, snappy and punchy, but also some body adding to it. So now let's listen to these individually. So I'm going to have a listen to the kick first, and I'll bring it in and out, and then I'm going to mess about with it so you can hear what this does. So you can hear the sound has changed quite a bit. There's a lot more low-end solidity going on there and low-end punch. So you can see what I've done here. At 52 hertz, I've got a Pultec curve, and it's boosted here by 3 dB, and then it's quite heavily saturated, and I decided I just wanted one saturation on this. And I chose this one because it just gave it a nice solid punch, without emphasizing the note of the kick too much, which I didn't want, because it's a tuned kick and there is a kind of note there, and saturation can sometimes kind of bring that out a bit, and I didn't want that too much, and this one seemed to work best for that. No saturation in the mids, and I pulled down a bit here, well, not the mids, the upper lows, 269, and then to bring out the click a bit here. There's a bit of saturation, but I didn't boost it at all, and I just added it here with a wide bell, and you can see what I've done here. So I'm going to mess about a bit now, and so you can just hear some of the other things that might be possible. So I'm just going to mess with the controls while I play this. So you can get the idea that you can add a lot of weight and thickness to the low end with the saturation. And this is only boosting 3 dB. Obviously I could boost it like a load more. But you can just hear by moving the saturation slider here that it thickens up that low end. And the combinations are a lot. And the combinations of drive that you can do are a lot. So there's a lot of scope here. So let's move on to the snare. So I'm just going to solo up the snare and I'm going to listen to it in and out, and then I'm going to mess about again. So you can hear it gives it a real kind of tough punch, which is really nice. And what I've done here is at 150 hertz, it's boosted, and I've got some saturation pushing a bit, a tight Q. I've cut here at 758 and a little bit of saturation, and then at the highs here at 3.7K, I've got a bit of boost with the saturation, a wide bell, and a bit of boost with the fair amount of boost with the EQ. And then here I've got 2 stages of saturation, both. If you watch those meters, you can see how much they're driving. And then I'm going to mess about a bit once you've had a look at these meters. So a huge range of tones. It was interesting at the end, I started, even though I've cut at those mids, I started driving it really hard, and it brought out the ring of the snare a lot. So yeah, like with on the kick, and even more so, there's just a huge range of tones you can get from this. And yeah, unlike a really extreme kind of EQ, and some of the other things on the market that EQ and either compress or saturate or all three at the same time, this one has to my ears, a really a natural feel to it. Like, it doesn't get artificial. It's all, you can drive it into like heavy overdrive, sure, but when you back it away from there, even with quite extreme EQ settings, or very extreme EQ settings and quite a bit of saturation, it still remains natural sounding. Really, really a lot like analog gear does. And yeah, it's really something special, this one. It really sounds fantastic to my ears. So finally, let's have a look at the overheads. And with this, I think I'm going to bring the kick and the snare in as well, just so you can hear it in context. That cymbal that he's hitting regularly, it really gives it a lush smoothness. So now I'm gonna mess around and see what I can do with this. So yeah, I mean, boosting the mids as well, I mean, it just becomes just beautifully creamy and lush and smooth, those cymbals. I hope you found this useful. I think this is a great addition to the saturation plugin tool set. I think it's easily stands on its own. It more than that, it really brings something new to the table that nothing else does the same way, and a level of sophistication not only in the features, which go well beyond most of the other ones out there and have a lot of unique features that nothing else has, but the sophistication of the sound, like with the Unisum compressor from this company, Tone Projects. It's just got that extra sophisticated sound, like it's got an expensive sound to it, expensive hardware sound to it. So I think it's fantastic. It's great for drums, it's great on anything, really. Vocals, bass, guitar, keyboards, anything you throw at it, it's going to sound great on, and it's a great mastering tool as well. So yeah, I hope you found this useful, and if you did, please do subscribe and give it a like, and I hope to see you next time.